Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us here on this beautiful Manitoba morning here at Laidlaw School. I want to thank both the superintendent and the principal of the school for being here this morning. It certainly is greatly appreciated. Well, back to school time. It's usually a time when students and parents are filled with excitement. My wife and I were buying school supplies and clothes over the weekend for our son as he gets ready to enter high school, and we felt that same sense of excitement. But it's a little bit different as well, because there is certainly mixed in with that excitement, there is anxiousness, and certainly we understand that. Parents in Manitoba and across Canada are feeling a different level of anxiousness than they have in the past. Over the past several months, the Department of Education, school divisions, school officials have been working to build off the very successful limited June school reopening to get to the regular reopening of schools on September 8th. But it is, of course, going to be different, and it has to be different for the safety of our students. Following the advice of public health, there have been many protocols that have already been announced and are being instituted. And as we have acknowledged all along in this process, these protocols and these precautions for the safety of our students are going to cost money. It is why in spring, when savings were being accrued from the closure of in-class learning, we asked the school divisions to hold on to those savings, knowing that in fall there was going to be a need for them. And in total, the school divisions did save about $48 million. That is $48 million that can now be used at this time to institute those new safety protocols for the benefit of our students and the staff that are in class. But as we have said, we would be and we have been working with school divisions to see what other needs they have. As we indicated, we would be there with them, working together as partners should. Today I'm announcing that school divisions will have an additional $52 million on top of the savings identified before, bringing the Return to School Fund to $100 million to ensure that our schools are ready for the return of our students. Again, we are announcing an additional $52 million on top of the savings that school divisions had already incurred to bring the total back to school fund at $100 million to ensure the safe return of students to Manitoba schools. As previously committed, the government has been purchasing and is distributing personal protection equipment to school. 4.7 million masks have already been shipped out to schools starting last week. In addition, we know that there will be more costs when it comes to transportation, to getting our students to schools. We also know that there are going to be increased sanitation costs, whether it is on those buses or in the schools, and both of those costs will be eligible from this new $52 million fund. And as stated when we announced the back to school plan, we also would expect, although we don't know to what degree, but there'll be higher degrees of absences, both when it comes to students, but also when it comes to teachers. So there will be human resource issues and challenges within the school system, and this fund will be eligible for that as well. The funds will be allocated as needed on a per pupil basis for the school divisions, and there will also be funding available for students in the independent schools. There'll be a portion of the fund that will be held back to address the urgent needs on a case-by-case basis as we learn about the new reality that COVID brings into our back-to-school plan and as the months and weeks go along. The new funding, along with the $48 million that was saved collectively by the school divisions, will mean that there is significant resources available to meet the demands that the pandemic is putting on our schools. We will, as we have been saying all along, continue to work with school divisions to determine what their pressure points are and what challenges lay ahead. For further information and details will be shared with the school divisions in the coming days. It is really the combined effort of our government, education partners, parents and students that we need for the return of our students to school. We are all working towards the same goal, to ensure that students can be in school and to do so in a safe way. Today's announcement is another significant piece of ensuring that that goal is met. We look forward to welcoming students back to school on September 8th, and I look forward to your questions now.
Mr. Goertzen, can you tell us again how exactly school divisions can access these funds?
Thanks for the question, Maggie. So the funds, now that they've been announced, we've been having significant conversations over the last weeks, months with school divisions in terms of what these additional costs could be. I know that there was a desire early on to simply just put out some kind of a global number to give some assurance in terms of the money that was there and that was available. We really wanted to work closely with the divisions to determine what that need was before we got into an actual number. And so now we'll have a process by which the school divisions can apply for funding. Of course, they have to use their savings first, right? The expectations would be that the savings that were garnered from money that taxpayers supplied but that weren't used in the spring will be used first for the safety protocols for students, and then they can apply into this fund for that which they don't have enough money for from the savings.
Where did you come up with that $52 million figure?
So that has been with working with the school division. So going back, I know that there was a degree of public desire to see some kind of a pot and a number floated out there for the last number of weeks. And while that would have been an easy thing to do, we've been working with the school divisions first to find out what their needs are, because it made more sense to find out what they actually needed and then to determine the costs. So the costs here are primarily made up of that personal protection equipment, the additional transportation costs, the additional sanitization costs, and then the human resources costs primarily make up where that $52 million will be allocated once they have expended the surplus funds that they had before.
So what happens, and I'll just pick a days, Christmas time, $100 million is gone. It's not enough. What happens?
Well, that's a lot of speculation in that question, Jeff, and I know that media like the speculative questions, but one of the things that I've learned, and I know you will have too, Jeff, in this process, in this pandemic, is that it doesn't actually help to do a lot of that kind of speculating. You try to plan for the future, you look at the things that you know, you put multiple plans in place to try to deal with some of those unknowns, and then you deal with the challenges that you have in that day while you're doing all that forward planning. So it would be very difficult to speculate what would be happening in December, whether we see that there's additional funding needed or whether this has been more than enough. But one thing that hasn't changed is we've consistently said that we will work with the school divisions, we'll provide support that is needed to ensure that students can go back to school safely. This is a demonstration of that commitment, and that commitment will continue throughout the school year.
Talk about busing and a lot of divisions have scaled back busing through their pattern. Is the expectation from the province that, look, here's some money that you can spend on busing. Do you expect divisions to put money into busing to bring those numbers up to provide that transportation insurance?
So we knew all along that busing would be one of the key concerns and challenges. And so back in June, which I know now seems like a long time ago, but we talked about the need for parents to prepare themselves and to potentially be able to drive their own children to school where that worked for them. And so the divisions, I know, have been reaching out to parents over the summer, asking them whether or not they'd be prepared to do that. So this funding certainly would allow, our hope, of course, as an education department would be that all of those students who desired and needed transportation or were eligible for transportation would have that made available. There may be other logistical issues than just money, though. And that might involve the availability of drivers and the availability of buses. And so while money, I think, is obviously helpful and is that sort of predeterminant for trying to solve that problem, it may not be the only obstacle. But it is, at least to the extent it was an obstacle, I think this helps school divisions meet that.
Mr. Goertzen.
Can school divisions apply more than one time for access to this funding?
Yeah, so my expectation would be that there'll sort of be, multiple requests as the school year goes along. They'll be using their funding that they had already accrued in terms of savings in the spring, and then they might be coming back on, a monthly or bi-monthly basis saying, okay, now we find ourselves short of sanitation supplies, and so we'd like to access the funds. Here's sort of the evidence that we've already used the taxpayers' money that was provided previously that existed as a surplus because of the in-class learning suspension in the spring. So now how can we access again this additional pot of money?
One thing that also this really doesn't address is overcrowding in the classrooms. It's a concern that continues to come up with a number of parents that I've spoken to, schools like Whitewich, for example, with like more than 30 kids in a classroom. How is the government addressing that?
So there's two issues there. I mean, the school divisions and the schools I know have been working well in terms of planning for their individual schools, and we're here at Laidlaw, but of course every school is different, right? Every configuration of a school is different. Every school population is a little bit different. So they are working and planning. Sometimes they're using additional space within that school where it exists, and I think you'll see more details on some of those school plans over the next couple of weeks. But in terms of that overall principle of students returning to school, we are guided by our chief provincial public health officer, and we are continually assured that while there is not a risk-free solution to anything when you're living in a pandemic, there are always the balance of risks. And there is significant risk for students not to be back in school. Some of that is a social risk, some of that is a more defined physical risk, and some more specific circumstances. So there are risks all around. But I think all of the evidence that our public health officials have looked at is to say there are far more benefits to students being back in classes than to not being back in classes. And with the plans in place, they believe that that can happen safely.
Mr. Goertzen, could you clarify on the $48 million for that to be done? Is that each individual school division that had their savings, or is it all in one whole pot, that $48 million, and that whole pot has to be gone before the $52 million can be accessed?
It'll be each individual school division, so they will have accumulated their own individual surpluses, and they'll have their own individual needs. School divisions can be remarkably different, right? I mean, we have some school divisions like Frontier, which cover, geographically more than half of the province and have very different needs than perhaps an urban school division. That doesn't mean that both don't have needs, but they may not look exactly the same. Their surpluses might not look exactly the same either as a result of that. So it's not a pot that's been put together. It resides within the individual school divisions.
Mr. Goertzen, some divisions are looking for guidance on masks. How many masks should, and parents want to know, how many masks do I send to school with my child every day? What is the guidance from the province going to be on masks and mask use?
So while there
We need to announce that today.
So while there'll be specific guidance provided before school starts, what we're saying now, and is demonstrated by the 4.7 million masks that have already been distributed, is that we'll ensure that there are reusable masks available for students along with disposable masks. And that'll be because there'll be some situations, of course, where students will forget to bring their reusable mask, or there'll be a situation where their reusable mask is for some reason needs to be replaced. And so we'll ensure that they have that, but I suspect that it'll become a little bit more clear as the individual plans get provided for from the schools. But we've made it clear that there will be the availability of masks within the schools, because again, there's going to be situations where Many schools are going to be able to obtain that 2-meter distance, which is really the gold standard for minimizing the transmission of COVID or of the virus. And so a lot of school divisions have worked really hard to get that 2-meter distance, and so the mandatory mask issue is entirely different for them potentially. There are high schools, probably the majority of high schools in Manitoba, who aren't going to be going back to full in-class learning every day, and so some of them are going on staggered days, some of them are going on different schedules, but that allows them to obtain that 2-meter distance, which is still considered the best way to minimize the transmission of the virus. So it's not all masks all the time. It's because we're looking to ensure first that primarily we can get that 2-meter distancing. Where that can't be achieved, then the masks are required and they will be provided.
I just want to be clear, guidance from the province is to parents. Reusable cloth masks should say how many they should bring to school every day?
I think it would be wise to assume that it should be part of your back-to-school supplies buying.
How many a day should they bring to the schools?
Re-
How many, Aaron, I want to know, the education
Yeah.
minister, how many masks am I sending to school with my kid? I want to know.
So as a reusable mask situation, I think that every child should be bringing a reusable mask. We'll have disposable masks within the schools for those who are forget it or something else happens to the mask during the day. And there'll be more specific guidance coming from public health on the masking issue.
Mr. Goertzen, there's
Yeah.
been sort of concerns about the resources that public institutions have versus private schools. I'm sure the Manitobans are curious what you are doing with your family and where your son is headed to school next fall.
Well, my son is heading to school where he's been going to school for the last number of years. I mean, as you know, the Manitoba Public Education Act allows for 3 different ways that students in Manitoba can get education. One is through the public school system. That's the system that I went through. First at the Elmdale Elementary School in Steinbach, then the junior high in Steinbach, as it was then called, and then the Steinbach Regional Secondary School, which now looks considerably different than when I went to high school. You are also allowed to send, if you choose, your children to independent schools and to homeschooling. As I've said many times in the past, those are all legitimate and legislated options. My son goes to a Christian school in Steinbach because we wanted him to have that faith perspective.
Mr. Goertzen, when you're talking about ensuring substitute teachers and educational staff are able to keep schools open and children learning, is that going to be on a division by division basis if they decide they need more substitute teachers, more full-time staff? That's where they would access that, or is there a recommendation by the province for how much they should be looking at having in reserve for each kind of division?
Yeah, so that planning happens at the division and the school level, and so they're already well advanced in terms of their planning on the human resource perspective. But what I think is unknown is how absentee rates will affect the system as a whole, and then individual divisions and schools in particular. That is something that we can't know because it sort of depends somewhat on how the transmission happens in the fall, and we're hopeful that it's minimal transmission within the school system, and then the human resource issues won't be as strong. But it really will be a division by division scenario based more upon their own individual planning and then the experience that happens with the virus.
Has there been much thought or discussion about limiting substitute teachers to a certain number of schools to help limit the spread? Because obviously if they don't get symptoms for a couple of weeks, if you work at 5 different schools within a week, it could spread it pretty quick.
It is something that public health and Dr. Goertzen has spoken about. This is actively monitoring, and they provide different advice to us. Obviously, then we would follow that advice as we always follow their advice on issues, whether it comes to masks or to the movement of substitute teachers. The substitute teachers, we have to remember, and I think sometimes we all equate it to the issue of personal care homes, and where we saw what was happening in personal care homes early in this pandemic in British Columbia and in Quebec and in Ontario. but not to minimize the effect of even substitute teachers moving around. Substitute teachers you can't equate them with nurses, and you can't equate students with residents in a PCH. The transaction between the two is very, very different, and so the ultimate response when it comes to protocols may be different as well. All right.
Can I ask a clarification?
Sure.
On the last, is that a combination, the 4.7 million, of reusable and disposable, or is it one type that's there?
I'll get you the details on it in terms of which ones have been distributed, and you might want to know where to, and so we can provide that.
We're listening to record days of, a jump in COVID-19 cases in the province. What do you say to parents whose fears are heightened as the school day moves closer and as numbers continue?
Yeah. So I'm a parent as well, and so I don't have to look far to see what those emotions feel like. I would say that we rely on the best experts and the best evidence that they have in Manitoba. And we've always known that during a pandemic, numbers were going to go up and numbers were going to go down. That is the nature of a pandemic. But what hasn't changed and what has helped us is relying on that local medical advice that is coming from our local medical experts. One of the great challenges during this pandemic has been things like social media, which in some ways, of course, are very helpful for providing useful information, and in some ways are very unhelpful in spreading unuseful information. And in this time, when we're all going through the pandemic globally, but there are different impacts and different realities in different parts of the world, people can search out and find different sorts of things that might impact one area that really don't have the same significance or relevance in Manitoba. To parents, I would say we have great medical experts who care about not only your children, but all Manitobans, and every decision they make it very, very thoughtfully and very, very carefully with only one ultimate goal in mind, and that is to make sure that students return to school safely. And I believe in the advice that they've been giving us and in the professionals that we have in those positions.
Clarify your answer to this next question. The chart, the template in front of you. With the restrictions added in Brandon, because they're in orange, is that, if they say that persisted past September 8th, does that change school plans then?
So it doesn't change the school plans at this point, but it's a good question, not just for Brandon, but for all school divisions. And so back in June, when we weren't quite sure what scenario we would be in September, we did ask school divisions to prepare for a number of different possibilities. And one of those possibilities would be that we may have to return to more of a at-home learning environment and suspend in-class learning. So school divisions have been putting together those plans. And at such a point where the guidance is that a school, wherever in the province or a division or a region, a health region, should go into a level where they return to at-home learning. Plans for that are in place, and I believe we don't want to be there because I don't think it's the best learning situation, but we'd be in a better situation than we were in March when we were essentially building the plane as we were flying it.
And that would be that critical event would trigger that, is that correct?
Well, I think Dr. Roustan has often said there are different things that will trigger different outcomes, right? It's the same thing within a school. You might have a couple of cases of COVID in a school because they've either may possibly come from outside the school environment, from a student working somewheres, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that there's been significant transmission in the school itself. And so you'd have to look at what is the actual contact tracing, the reality of that situation, and you can't respond just simply on a numbers basis. You have to look at the context and the narrative behind those numbers, because not every time you get a large number of cases, they're not all the same. Community spread is different than something that is contained and traceable.
How many more school buses and school drivers do you anticipate are needed, and how much of this funding is earmarked for that?
I don't have a number for you because it's variable to the different school divisions, and I think the challenges are different even rural to urban. There are some rural divisions, I think, who've had an easier time, perhaps, putting together a busing plan than some urban divisions. But there's been challenges all around, and it has been one of the more significant challenges. And so I know that there are school divisions already who've gone out there and procured or found access to buses, and others I'm sure who are still sort of struggling with that. But I don't have the exact number because it would rest more with the school divisions. But the funding announced today, to the extent that that is the obstacle, will be supportive of that. But again, you know, money isn't the only obstacle. There's logistical obstacles as well.
We have time for one more, guys.
I'm just curious about the education review. Is there any update on when we might ever be seeing that document?
If you're looking for a date, Maggie, there isn't an update on that. I would say this: when I mean, I really wanted it. We were scheduled to release the K-12 commission right before spring break. I think on the Friday before spring break, and so. When that didn't happen, it was a great disappointment to me and to everybody who had worked on it for so very long. And so while I and the commission and others in the system were personally disappointed, there are sometimes things in life that come up that make you put things aside, whether that's in your personal life or whether that's in the life of a government. And it quickly became apparent, although you know we might have sort of struggled with that reality for a couple of days, that we couldn't ask the school system to focus on reforming the school system at the same time it was essentially trying to keep their head above water when it came to dealing with the pandemic. Now I think we're in a much better place now in September, but I don't think it would be fair to ask the school system to, you know, keep one eye on reform and one eye on trying to ensure that everything goes as well as we believe it will go in September. They need to focus on that. So I wouldn't expect anything until at least early next year. I think we want to give the school divisions and the officials the assurance that their full focus and attention should be on this.
Has the pandemic, do you think, changed the content of it?
No, no, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed the contents of it. So the commissioners haven't gone back and reworked it. But I mean, you know, on the other side of this, you know, maybe people when they read it will look at it in something of a different light, right? Because I mean, a lot of things have changed in our lives. So.
Just quickly, how quickly will that money flow once a division, or is it the division that applies for the funding on behalf of schools, or the individual schools that can?
Well, I think every effort is going to be made, and this is more maybe, you know, sort of a treasury board kind of discussion. But you know, I give folks within that part of government a lot of credit, right? Where they have seen the need that's been demonstrated, they've been really, really good at working as well. So anybody watching this is going to say government never works fast. I would say it works as fast as government ever has in terms of getting funding out.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thanks everyone.